What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Sunday, it's game day, you know what time it is. We're going over the tight end starts and sits. I will admit, however, it's a pretty gross week for tight ends. You can clearly see it up at the top with players like George Kittle injured, Travis Kelce bye week, and even lower players ranked inside the top 18 like Irv Smith Jr., an up-and-comer, and Dalton Schultz, somebody as a streaming candidate as of late. Those players are either injured or on bye as well. We'll go over the top 18 however, but if you want the exact rankings, you can access that at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website not only gain access to the rankings, you'll get all of our waiver information, the trade model, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, once again, that's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link as always in the description box below. With that, let's hop right into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which player currently leads the league in rushing yards over expectation. The correct answer was Dalvin Cook. Congratulations to Ro. You got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, we're just going to reverse that. Which player currently ranks dead last in rushing yards over expectation? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that out of the way though, let's hop right into the top 6 tight ends. Leading this list, of course, is Darren Waller, the only premium tight end that we have this week. When I say premium, I'm not saying the only tight end with a high ceiling this week. Several of the players you're seeing listed here definitely do have a high ceiling. However, Darren Waller has proven to be safe and consistent, and despite heading into what could be more of a meh matchup, there are some reasons to believe he could have a very successful day. For starters, it's true that the Denver Broncos have not allowed a receiving touchdown since week 1 against Tennessee, in which they allowed 2 receiving touchdowns to Jonnu Smith. Since then, they've tightened things up a bit, but let's remember, Darren Waller, he was never really known as a big touchdown guy. Yes, he has been breaking that trend as of late, but it's not a requirement for him to score a touchdown in order for him to produce. Half PPR leagues, full PPR leagues, he should find plenty of success with a high floor this week. The Denver Broncos just allowed 8 receptions for 74 yards to the tight end position against Atlanta just a week ago. And a few weeks back, when they did face Kansas City, Travis Kelce probably would have had one heck of a game had the Chiefs not had such an incredible lead and not been forced to target Kelce with a high amount of volume. Waller has now scored in 3 of his past 4 contests, has not had a game under 5 receptions since week 3, so lock him up as a premier option at the position and the top ranked tight end we have this week. The next tight end we have is TJ Hockenson, who's been playing out of his mind as of late. If you think Waller's 3 of his past 4 games with a receiving touchdown is impressive, well, we gotta give some credit to Hockenson, who has now scored a receiving touchdown in 4 of his past 5. In addition to that, weeks 9 and 8 were the 2 single games in which he's received the most targets he's received all season. So clearly, the volume for Hockenson, it is increasing. We shouldn't expect that to change in this matchup, especially with Kenny Golladay already being ruled out. And when it comes to the Washington defense, while yes, they're one of the better defenses at mitigating fantasy points to both wide receivers as well as running backs, believe it or not, they are ranked in the bottom 5 at defending opposing fantasy tight ends. Hockenson in this matchup is primed to produce, and if Matthew Stafford struggles to get anything going through the air at the wide receiver position, the run game, if that's not successful either, expect him to rely heavily on Hockenson, giving him an extremely high ceiling this week. The next player we have, Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos. This just goes to show you exactly how mediocre the top 6 is at this point. Noah Fant, we can't really say he has a high floor. The ceiling for a player with his talent level and the way that Drew Lock's been playing, we know that he does have somewhat of a high ceiling, but the Las Vegas Raiders, they currently rank top 10 when it comes to defending fantasy tight ends. Noah Fant as well has not scored a receiving touchdown since week 2, and his volume throughout the entire season has been somewhat shaky. What he does have have going for him though is that Travis Kelce and Rob Gronkowski, who have both faced this defense in the past 4 weeks, they both had incredible games, and since those two matchups in which they got torched by those tight ends, they haven't really faced any other tight ends at that level of talent. Noah Fant, he certainly brings that package to the table, so for him to have a game in that type of category, it should not surprise anyone whatsoever. Speaking of Rob Gronkowski, he's going to be our next tight end. This week he faces Carolina on the road. The last time we saw Tom Brady play, he had his worst game as a Buccaneer, probably one of the worst games of his career, at least as of late as well. And honestly, facing the Carolina Panthers defense, it's not necessarily a great matchup overall from a passing perspective. I will say, however, similarly to Washington, as I had mentioned earlier, the Carolina Panthers are much worse at defending opposing tight ends as opposed to the wide receivers. So if Brady struggles to get anything going through the air, you can definitely expect Rob Gronkowski to have some heavy involvement. Despite a bunch of pass attempts a week ago, the volume really didn't find its way to Gronkowski, so the floor for him in this matchup is not going to be all that high. The ceiling will also have a cap on it, but even in a divisional game where sometimes anything can happen, Tom Brady usually finds a way to come back from a bad performance and try to make a statement the following week. Up next, Evan Engram of the New York Giants. This one is definitely a floor play. This is a player who over the past 3 weeks has had a whopping 29 receiving targets, while in actuality that only amounted to 1 receiving touchdown through that span, and one of the defenses they had faced through that span was also Philly. His 9 targets in that matchup only amounted to 6 receptions for 46 yards. We simply can't discredit that the Philadelphia Eagles, they are a bottom 3 defense in allowing fantasy points to the position, a really juicy matchup overall. So with Engram getting a second crack at this defense, the volume presumably going to be near its highest, we've got to expect likely better results than in their last matchup, but could we really be disappointed with a 6 reception game either? The final top 6 tight end we have is also in that same matchup with Evan Engram. Of course, we're talking about Dallas Goedert. Anyone who started him in his last week 8 matchup against Dallas before the bye, they were definitely disappointed. While he did play on a high amount of snaps, 85% to be specific, his role was definitely more of a decoy role. His involvement we can expect to go up though in this game. We knew heading into that Dallas matchup, the Eagles, they wanted to preserve his health, avoid some hits for a player not trying to push himself to the max, especially with a bye week the following week. So heading into this matchup, another divisional game in which a lot is riding on the line from a playoff perspective, Dallas Goedert, he is much less likely to play a decoy role. His floor though, we do have to recognize is going to be low. We just saw that example against Dallas. If the Philadelphia Eagles are going out to a big lead or the game is out of hand by any metric, Dallas Goedert, once again, his involvement may be limited. We're moving into the next 6 tight ends, and I think the first thing that everyone will notice is a lot of these players have been ranked inside the top 6 for many of the past few weeks. While Mark Andrews is the most polarizing name, we're starting with Hunter Henry here of the LA Chargers. If I'm being frank here, I would not give anyone a hard time if they wanted to shoot for more upside than Hunter Henry potentially brings to the table over the last 4 weeks. His receiving yardage, 23 yards, 23 yards, 33 yards, and 33 yards, going over no more than 4 receptions in any of those contests. So while yes, he has been consistent, considering the fact that he has not scored a receiving touchdown, while you could easily argue that he's due for one, Hunter Henry has been consistently performing at a pretty low level. That isn't to say that he couldn't succeed in this matchup. While the projected over-under is just around 49 points, which doesn't seem all that high, the projected totals for nearly all the games this week are definitely on the lower side. The higher projected games, you're not seeing a lot of high-end tight ends in those matchups either, so Hunter Henry kind of finds himself in a really good sweet spot. Moving over to the more polarizing Mark Andrews though, as much as the name constitutes a top 5 ranking most weeks. We do have to recognize Lamar Jackson has not been playing very well from a passing perspective. The matchup against New England, it's also extremely limiting because the New England Patriots allow the least fantasy points to the tight end position. Mark Andrews is coming off of 3 very poor performances in those contests. The most receptions he's had in a single game is 3, with the most receiving yardage in any of those contests being 32 yards, while also being held scoreless, nor eclipsing 6 receiving targets in those matchups. The floor for Mark Andrews, it's pretty low. He's always a threat to score on a busted play, but let's be frank, the New England Patriots, they play a pretty tight defense. The next player though, definitely more risky, but with plenty of upside, that's Eric Ebron. Eric Ebron has seen steady and consistent volume from Ben Roethlisberger, especially as of late, and has now scored in back-to-back games. Heading into this week against Cincinnati, the matchup really couldn't be any more juicy. The Bengals, believe it or not, over the past 4 weeks have allowed 6 receiving touchdowns to tight ends. In 3 of those 4 games, they've also allowed 6 or more receptions. The yardage they allow, it's at one of the highest in the league. So if Ben Roethlisberger does get Eric Ebron involved against this defense, Eric Ebron should be able to feast. Another tight end with a great matchup is Austin Hooper this week. The Cleveland Browns will be facing Houston. The only thing I believe potentially limiting him from having a phenomenal day this week is definitely going to be the weather. We're expecting high winds, rain as well, and Baker Mayfield, who has missed some practice this week, even with the absence of Odell Beckham and the volume presumably for Austin Hooper projected to be higher than usual, the risk in starting him, even in a matchup that would typically be a high floor matchup, we're just not going to have that luxury this week. The next tight end we have is Mike Gesicki. The wild card, of course, being Tua and his production. The volume for Mike Gesicki, it hasn't really been extremely high since we saw Ryan Fitzpatrick step down or be put in a reserve role. But what I will say about it is that his volume has seemed to been increasing. If you actually look at the volume he's received versus the total pass attempts and completions that Tua has thrown, there is actually some pretty promising numbers there. As we know, rookie and inexperienced quarterbacks tend to target tight end at a higher rate than usual. While we haven't yet seen that to its full extent with Tua and Gesicki, considering this matchup is against the Chargers, who have forced shootouts in nearly every game that Herbert's been starting, the Chargers also being a bottom 6 defense in allowing fantasy points to tight ends, the matchup in which Mike Gesicki might break out in a sense with Tua, it could definitely be this week. The final top 12 tight end that we have ranked this week is going to be Jimmy Graham of the Chicago Bears. I will say he exceeded my personal expectations last week, catching 6 of 6 targets, even scoring a touchdown. And while yes, he only did compile 45 receiving yards, we already know with Jimmy Graham, his damage mostly isn't done through high yardage between the 20s. He's a red zone threat, and this week facing Minnesota, I would say he has a solid chance to score once again. Minnesota has now allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end in 3 of the last 4 games. The one game that they didn't allow a receiving touchdown through that span, they were torched for 8 receptions for 125 yards to tight ends. Keep in mind though that the projected total is probably lower than you would have expected, coming in at a mere 43 points. With Minnesota also being favorites on the road, we already know with their offense, they would prefer to run it on every play. So Jimmy Graham, despite having a really solid matchup, his floor, of course, is not going to be astronomically high. Moving over to the final 6 tight ends, we just need to gloss over these guys. Preferably, we would not want to be starting them if we have a better option ranked ahead of these guys. But to start, Jared Cook, a familiar name that we typically have ranked inside of the top 12. We unfortunately saw, though, the low end of his type of production, with Michael Thomas returning in week 9 against Tampa Bay, a game in which Drew Brees threw 32 pass attempts, completed 26 of them, even threw for 4 passing touchdowns. Jared Cook was virtually left in the dust. He finished the game with 3 targets, 2 receptions for 30 yards, and with the other tight ends on this team making appearances in the red zone, it's not an outlandish question to wonder if he will be featured in that area this week. The next tight end we have is Robert Tonyan of the Green Bay Packers. This is definitely definitely a wild card type of player. We're not sure if his involvement from one week to the next is really going to be high or low. Ever since Davante Adams returned, the passing game definitely filters through him. Nobody else really receives a consistent target market share, so Robert Tonyan, he's going to be a risky play this week, but the matchup against Jacksonville, it definitely presents its own level of upside. Only 3 games this season has Jacksonville not allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end. They've also allowed 2 multi-TD games to the tight end position, as well as allowing a 100+ yard game to the tight end position as well throughout this year. While it's unlikely Aaron Rodgers will need to rely on anyone outside of Davante Adams to push the ball downfield, Robert Tonyan, even coming off of a 1-target performance, definitely has the upside to produce in this specific matchup. The next player we have is Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. Of course, this is the range where it's usually touchdown or bust, so we're not heavily relying on volume in order to rank these players higher, more their chance to actually score, and Logan Thomas has proven behind Terry McLaurin to be the second most consistently used receiver in this passing offense. He has actually scored in 2 of his last 3 games, is coming off the most targets he's received since week 3, and we cannot forget they're playing Detroit this week, a defense that just allowed Irv Smith Jr. to have 2 receiving touchdowns just last week. The next tight end we have is Tyler Higbee. I'm going to be straight up with you guys. I'm going to be blunt. I don't love it. Cooper Kupp, who was potentially going to be inactive this game, he is going to play. If he wasn't going to play, maybe we could consider more potential opportunities for a player like Higbee. But what we do know is that the Seattle Seahawks, they're going to be putting up a ton of points. They do allow a lot of points to the wide receiver position, so I'm much higher on Cooper Kupp, Reynolds, as well as Woods. But with the Rams in a position where they're likely going to have to score in the passing game a factor through all 4 quarters, Tyler Higbee, yes, he does have a chance to make it into the end zone. The next player we have, Jordan Reed. Had he not put up such a dud last week, we would feel more comfortable ranking him higher. He is in a spot taking over for George Kittle, a role that we know is very fruitful for fantasy, but last week against the Green Bay Packers, we saw the 49ers opt to use many other tight end options outside of Reed. He was, of course, activated the same day of the game, basically last minute. His health certainly played a factor in his opportunities, but we don't know for certain that his health has really progressed that much further, how much he will be used. If we knew for sure he'd play on 80+% of snaps and be the primary target at the tight end position, like I said, he'd be ranked much higher, but for right now, we really can't even trust him as a top 15 option. The final player we have is Kyle Rudolph, a name that we really haven't brought up very often, especially in these tight end videos, for good reason, of course. Irv Smith Jr., he definitely took over as the primary target from the tight end position in this offense, but as we all know, Irv Smith is not going to be playing, which means Kyle Rudolph may see even more opportunities than Irv Smith has seen as of late. Keep in mind though, the projected total is a mere 43 points. Kyle Rudolph hasn't been fantasy relevant in quite a while either, but to be fair, the Chicago Bears have allowed a receiving touchdown in each of the past 3 games, actually allowing 4 total through that span. Currently, the Chicago Bears rank bottom 5 in defending opposing fantasy tight ends, so the opportunity, it will be there, but of course, we're not holding our breath. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.